Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Clinical Trials Showcase. We've got a very jam-packed afternoon with lots of really exciting presentations and guests with us. Professor Les Bouquet is going to open the session for us and provide us the opening address. And then Auntie Kerry is going to follow on with the acknowledgement of the traditional owners. So I'll hand over to Les for the opening address.
Thank you. Can you hear me there, Meg?
We can, Les.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for that introduction. I will leave it to Auntie Kerry to do the traditional acknowledgement. Thank you, Auntie Kerry. But I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and to those of their descendants who are amongst us today. Clinical trials are the cornerstone of good research. They ensure that translation of research and models of care is evidence-based. We have witnessed this and are still witnessing this in rapid fire action during this COVID pandemic. The introduction of new models of care, preventative measures, vaccine, and adjunct therapies have been entirely dependent on clinical trials rather than supposition. These last 2 years have seen clinical trials dictate government policy. And it is very evident that without clinical trials, many more human beings would not have made it through this terrible pandemic that is still current. Southwest Sydney Local Health District and the Ingham Institute have recognised and acknowledged the importance of clinical trials. We have invested significantly in establishing one of the best clinical trials unit in Australia. We'll soon have a dedicated clinical trial centre in our refurbished buildings, and we have a phase 1 clinical trial unit at Liverpool Hospital. This investment, especially over the last 3 years, has seen the appointment of Meg Ford as its executive director. Meg and her entire team, I won't name them all, but all of her team have transformed, I really mean that, have transformed our clinical trial unit into one which is eagerly supported and respected by our researchers, our collaborators, and industry alike. I thank you, Meg, and your team for your hard work and dedication. Today's symposium includes outstanding speakers, and I welcome them and thank them for their participation. In particular, I welcome our consumer group. It is refreshing and essential to have that participation. And I think their formal inclusion in our program is ever so welcome. And thank you for being part of this. Finally, can I thank Anne-Marie de Souza, Rachel Goldrick, and all of their team at the Research Directorate for organising this meeting. And thank you very much. And I'm sure we're going to enjoy and learn from this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Les. I'll just do the, oh, what a great photo. I'll just do the acknowledgement and welcome. I don't want to talk about prednisone, but let's consider that. So, Australia has nowhere in any part of the country that didn't have an Aboriginal mob or family that looked after the country and the resources. And Aboriginal people have long used trials to determine what resources worked. For example, there's a certain berry from around the Brisbane area that one can only consume if it's been left in the water of a river, a running water, for at least 2 weeks before you can eat it. Similar to the rotten corn for Maoris, but trust me, don't eat that. It's sorry if you're from New Zealand. So we know then that people who run clinical trials, well, we love you, and we just want you to remember us. We want to welcome you to the country that we're on, and remember that the Earth is our mother, and she knows all our footprints, and we are all welcome to walk on her. Thank you, Uncle Les et al.
Thank you, Auntie Kerry. I'd now like to introduce Mark Parsons, who is going to talk to us about his experience of how he became a clinician researcher and a clinical trialist. So welcome, Mark.
Yeah, well, thanks, Megan, and thanks, Uncle Les and Auntie Kerry. We have to catch up, Auntie Kerry. I'm sorry I haven't caught up with you lately. I've only got 12 minutes, so I have to go very quickly here. But can I say I've only been in Sydney in the southwest for a couple of years, and it's been wonderful working with many of you, including the people at this table, including Les and Auntie Kerry. So I'm going to quickly talk about my pathway and being as a clinician researcher and clinical trialist as quickly as I can, Meg. But clinician research is the frontline health service professionals, which can be of any craft group, for want of a better word, and perform research and research translation alongside the usual clinical care duties. And I won't go through all of these dot points, but recruiting participants into suitable studies, particularly clinical trials, should be core business for any clinical researcher. And I guess as you progress, then you can start to design your own clinical trials, and we can talk a bit about that. We have many other roles as clinician researchers, and of course, involvement of consumers in research is crucial, and I'll be on a panel about that next, I think. Some of you might be aware of this little circle that some people call a learning health cycle and a few other things, but there are different pathways on the circle where you can become involved in research, and I guess clinical trialists are predominantly the evidence producers there on the left part of the circle, but there are many other areas that you can work in clinical research and research translation, and we need more clinician researchers across all of these domains. Now, I'm going to talk a bit more about stroke because that's obviously my field and passion, and the way stroke management has changed in the last 30 or 40 years has been driven by clinical research and clinical trials, and back in the 80s, which was well before I did medicine, but Les was obviously practicing then, and there was this concept of the ischemic penumbra that was an experimental concept where a couple of groups in the UK and Germany discovered that when you reduce blood flow to the brain, once it went below a certain threshold, that brain would die. But if the blood flow was reduced but not down too low, you could save that tissue, and that was called the penumbra. And it took us, in the last 30 years, we've translated that experimental finding into clinical practice with advanced brain imaging, and a lot of my research has been related to that. And these are just some of the papers which I won't go through, but that's back in 2007 when we were first experimenting with a new technique on CT to measure brain blood flow. And then we were looking at the collateral blood flow, which are like bypass vessels when you bypass a blocked vessel to get blood to the brain. And this led to us working with a small company in Melbourne to develop software to actually display how much brain was salvageable and how much was already damaged. And now routinely this software is used in many hospitals, including Liverpool Hospital. And it's quite interesting when I do a ward round with the junior doctors and they see this software, and they don't know that I had anything to do with it. So it's quite interesting to see. Now, in terms of clinical trials, we've also, in the last 20 or 30 years, translated clot dissolving or thrombolytic therapy from experimental work into clinical practice. And a lot of that has been driven by using this advanced imaging to better select patients in clinical trials. And I'll just show you some examples of that. So this is quite a long time ago now, 2008, we did the first trial using MRI to select patients for thrombolysis. And that was a relatively small Australian and New Zealand study. And at the same time, we started experimenting with a newer thrombolytic that had already been used in cardiology called tenecteplase, the standard being alteplase. And I was the first to use this in human stroke back in Newcastle, which was possibly a bit foolhardy, but it worked out okay. And following on from that, we did a larger phase 2 study, but it was only a few Australian sites that was published in New England Journal in 2012. And since then, we've extended the time window for thrombolysis using advanced imaging in a number of publications. And currently, in terms of clinical trials, I'm running 2 large international clinical trials comparing tenecteplase to the standard of care in 2 different types of stroke, so non-large vessel occlusions and also in large vessel occlusions where we also do clot retrieval now. And indeed, in 2015, there was a massive practice change. There were 5 studies that all came out in the same edition of the New England Journal showing that endovascular clot retrieval was superior to thrombolysis alone for stroke. And our Australian study was the one, the endovascular therapy for ischemic stroke with perfusion imaging selection in the right column. This led to huge practice change very quickly, and this was off the back of these 5 clinical trials. So clinical trials done properly can change practice quickly. And this has led to massive improvements in patient outcomes with the worst type of stroke. We're also doing another large multinational trial that's NHMRC funded in patients that are having clot retrieval to see if tenecteplase prior is more effective. And just to say that all of these practice changes have now been translated into clinical practice. So there's a true example of research translation. And so even from pre-hospital now, we're notifying the hospital of patients with stroke. We're doing advanced imaging. We're giving thrombolysis. We're pulling the clot out with endovascular therapy, none of which, even when I started medicine, which was a little while ago, we didn't have any of these treatments available. That's all from clinical trials. And how do we do it? This is just my advice. Start small. And I always use my clinical observations to answer and frame research questions. I really like this quote from Markku Kasta, who's a very famous Finnish neurologist. And for those of you who know the Finnish, they tend to be pretty direct. And when Markku retired, this was part of his retirement speech, he said, "Don't do research with people you don't like." And I would say that's a very good advice. Unfortunately, it's not always possible when you start off, but as you build, you can get pickier. But it is very important to collaborate, noting the above rule. Often when we first start, we have to do industry-sponsored research to support our own academic research, and most units, I think, have the best units have a good mix of both academic and industry-sponsored research. How do you build the team? Well, it depends on what your aims are, but I think it's really important to have a research coordinator. And when I started, it was a hybrid nurse position with a clinical role. Next, you need a good administrative assistant. Generally, again, it's a mix of research and clinical. If you're lucky, you can find someone who's good at grant writing and applications apart from yourself. And then you take on students at different levels. And these are some of the teams that I've helped build over the years. That's Newcastle. I look a bit younger there. That's Melbourne. I look slightly older there. And this is now where I'm a bit older. And this is only some of our clinical stroke and neurology and neurointerventional research team. But now we've got a combination of researchers across Sydney and Melbourne, which we sort of call the Sydney Brain Centre and the Melbourne Centre, which is based at the Ingham. And I'll just say finally that you need a really strong clinical service platform to build clinical research into. And my motto has always been, inspired by others, but for every patient you admit and treat, and even see in the outpatient clinic, you should think, what study can I put this patient in? Patients not enrolled in research should be the exception to the rule rather than the opposite. And finally, there are barriers, particularly if you play for New South Wales. And I won't go into the details, but obviously in health services, there are obviously some people who don't understand the benefits of an integrated clinical research service. So, you need to work on those people. It takes time. It's not for everyone. You can make more money doing private practice, but you can't have as much fun. And most of all, patients enrolled in clinical trials actually do better than those that aren't. And patients in research active units do better than patients that are not looked after in research active units. And there's lots of data to support that, particularly in the cancer field, actually. So why bother? As I've said, better outcomes for your patient. It's more fun. What's really great fun is mentoring young people coming through in research. And you also get to see the world and make lifelong friends around the world. I think that's Taiwan top left, that's Germany bottom left, that's Barcelona bottom right, and that's China top right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks very much, Mark. You're actually ahead of time. So
Really? Okay. Wow.
very
That was like about 35 slides.
So thanks very much. Mark has really developed the clinical trials team across the LHD since he's arrived in southwestern Sydney. So hearing that, and we all think clinical trials are fun. So I'm glad to hear that you do as well, Mark. We now welcome Abby Powell to present to you. So Abby's going to present about cancer clinical trials and the translational research in southwestern Sydney. Abby also leads our phase 1 clinical trial unit in Liverpool Hospital, and he will also be on the panel a little bit later on. So thanks, Abby, over to you.
Thanks, Meg. Hi everyone. My name is Abhi Pal, and I'm a medical oncologist at Liverpool. And I'll be speaking about cancer clinical trials and translational research in Southwest Sydney. And I've called this talk An Unfinished Story of Equity and Hope. Let me just... so 12 minutes. It's going to be pretty quick. It probably raised quite a lot of questions, but I think we'll have some time later on. So I'll be covering just a couple of topics, just about what's happening in cancer and what's happening in cancer clinical trials, what some of the issues are, what some challenges we've found in Southwest Sydney and how we're meeting those challenges, and our kind of vision for what cancer clinical trials could look like in our district. So this is probably for the people who don't do oncology. So what's happening? So first of all, cancer actually is the leading cause of mortality in the developed world. It overtook cardiovascular disease, I think the year before last. It's going to become more common, affect more Australians. We're doing much more and more research in screening and prevention of cancer. So HPV vaccines for cervical cancer, breast screening, colonoscopy awareness, and some really exciting research about picking up cancers early through circulating tumor DNA. But unfortunately, with advanced cancers, so that's metastatic, stage 4, terminal, all synonymous, the vast majority are still incurable and will carry a poor prognosis. But key takeaway from today, the last 20 years have seen a phenomenal acceleration in the range of drugs and agents we have to treat cancers, such that people with advanced cancers are living for longer, living better, and in some cases approaching cure. I see these images of PET scans showing resolution all the time. So this is an example of BRAF targeted therapy in melanoma and just disease melting away on a PET scan. So some of the superstar breakthroughs that you might have heard about or might not have in the last 15 years in medical oncology, we've got highly effective oral tablets with minimal side effects. One example is alectinib, which is an oral tyrosine kinase inhibitor. And in a subset of advanced lung cancer, the 5-year survival approaches 60%. So that's people with lung cancer, advanced stage 4 lung cancer, 60% are alive at 5 years. Things have changed drastically. And their quality of life is fine. These drugs don't cause problems. 3 weekly intravenous infusions of combination immune therapy of nivolumab, ipilimumab in metastatic melanoma, 5-year survival of 52%. This melanoma was an absolute death sentence. Survival was approaching 0% at 2 years, probably 10 years ago. So half the people are alive at 5 years. Radiopharmaceuticals. So we've done, at Liverpool, done a lot of work in radiopharmaceuticals, so lutetium PSMA. So in prostate cancer, this is targeted therapy showing benefits for quality of life. And this year at our oncology meeting, we had pembrolizumab in mismatch repair deficient rectal cancer, which obviated the need for surgery, chemotherapy, or radiotherapy. This is, oncology is in its prime at the moment. And of course, the Daily Mail jumped in on this and said, doctors are left stunned as cancer disappears. We generated a lot of phone calls from patients. But there's much more to that story. So we are seeing some outstanding success stories in cancer. Oncology has been traditionally met with a bit of nihilism and despair. And much of my job is letting patients, trainees, and colleagues know that we have better biomarker technologies, more personalized medicine, and more effective therapy that have less side effects. This progress, as Les said at the front with COVID vaccines, has only been made possible through well-designed cancer clinical trials. Every single one of those things I said on the slide before, through trials. So cancer clinical trials are fundamental in this revolution. But there's a bit more happening here, though. So the time between a positive scientific discovery, someone going, okay, I think I've seen something in a dish, to a first-in-human clinical trial will be roughly 5 to 10 years. And from the first-in-human trial to getting it to my loved one in Australia could be another 10 years by the time it gets through phase 1, 2, 3 and trials. So cancer is a life-threatening disease. So if patients don't get on a trial or that drug, then they're likely to never get it. So there's no such thing as waiting for a trial treatment to come onto PBS. So this is another takeaway for all of you, is that oncologists and well-versed patients recognize that the best outcome for patients with cancer is getting onto a clinical trial so they can access to the latest therapies in a regulated and safe manner. And that's recognized by international guidelines for cancer as well. But there's more to it now. So this is section 2. What's the problem? Research repeatedly shows that cancer clinical trial populations are not diverse and do not represent the real world population. The majority of patients on cancer clinical trials are Caucasian, highly educated, and of a high socioeconomic status. And this is data that's been replicated across the world: United States, United Kingdom, Australia. We had a welcome to country at the start of this session. The rates of Indigenous recruitment are either not recorded or vanishingly small. I did a fellowship at the Royal Marsden Hospital in the UK, and I was in London, which is one of the most diverse places in the world. And my studies, I could see that the trial population, again, fits those same characteristics, even though there was a huge diverse population around us. So this is a problem. So I've told you a couple of things: great progress, great trials, but the people who get onto these trials are not representative. Why is this? So cancer clinical trials tend to be conducted at large centers that are concentrated in these kind of attributes. Participating in clinical research requires a high degree of health literacy. I remember family carers literally chasing me down to get their loved ones on trial. So, and participating in research requires advantage. That's something we have to understand. Patients need additional capacity in their lives for uncertainty, for risk, and for time. And when you think about it like this, it's almost unsurprising that the trial populations are so homogenous. So there is a problem here we need to kind of think about. We have research done in southwestern Sydney that demonstrates by Ben Smith's group, that limited English proficiency is unfavorable to trial participation. So you can see that trial participation was lower. They looked at 20,000 patients almost, that it was 5.7% in CALD patients, so culturally and linguistically diverse patients, versus non-CALD at 8.4%. So this is clear data that there is, even right here where we are, that there's a problem. This is some other data just from overseas. You look at SEER databases from America, and you look at the African-American, Hispanic white breakdown, not representative at all. You look at clinical trials leading to FDA oncology drug approvals, you can see white is far above what you would expect it to be if it was representative. And finally, you can see participants in precision oncology, the observed ratio versus expected is very different. So I think this is it's a very interesting problem. it kind of crosses into like kind of politics and socioeconomics, but still, it's still part of our core business. So part 3, what are the challenges of doing cancer clinical trials in Southwest Sydney? I've trained at Liverpool and I did my medical oncology training in Bankstown, Campbelltown, Liverpool. I've worked here since last year and I've trained here for a year. I understand this. I've also trained at Royal Prince Alfred. So our community is extraordinarily diverse and it's different. And it's the type of community that has been traditionally excluded from cancer trials, the things I described. 1 in 2 will speak another language or come from different background. And our community, we just have to be clear, does have a higher than average degree of socioeconomic disadvantage and poor literacy. This is just some stats I pulled out. I could have pulled out any stats here. The life expectancy across Sydney, this is data from 2020. Look at Campbelltown at 74 years, Liverpool 81 years. You look across Sydney, Bradfield, 87 years, North Sydney 86 years. Simple measures like this, you can see that gradient of mortality. And obviously there's other things that correlate with that. There's a parliamentary report into delivering health. And like Mark said, delivering clinical research is dependent on clinical service as well. So these two have to be integrated. So there was a parliamentary inquiry into Southwest Sydney and how services have been funded. You can see the disadvantage there. And this is just an excerpt that I read out to trainees sometimes. The Southwest Sydney population experiences greater challenges on basically every indicator. So SES, unemployment, low levels of English, high rates of humanitarian settlement, high rates of disability, high rates of lifestyle diseases. So that raises issues. And so I just want you to all come into my clinic for a second. So yeah, it's 4 p.m. on a busy Monday afternoon for me. And I've just met Mr. Clark. He's a 70-year-old man who has just developed castrate resistant, so not responding to hormones, prostate cancer. There's a fantastic clinical trial. This is a list of things I need to cover in a very short period of time. I've got to break the bad news, he's progressed. I've got to address the anxiety, explain the limitations, explain clinical research, address misconceptions. Am I a guinea pig? What is industry's role? Explain the uncertainty, explain the time commitment, explain randomization, given PIS. Now I'm going to make one small change here. I've just made a Mr. Win. And now just think about how much more complex this conversation is going to become. Before March 2020, I was doing this with an in-person interpreter. That's going to be at least double the length of time for me to go through each of those 9 points to Mr. Win. And then think about, I'm doing this on a phone interpreter when the in-person interpreter is not available. So you can see why the rates of recruitment are going to be less in these populations. There's going to be an issue. And think about the fact that also Mr. Win, comes from a large family where everyone works, people can't take time off, maybe didn't complete high school, his limited ability to process information, limited access to financial support. And then there's culture-specific things as well. Maybe he has cultural beliefs about alternative medicine or Western medicine. Maybe he can't drive. So there's challenges in ensuring equity of trial, and we've got to think about them in a structured manner. So can we overcome all of these hurdles and deliver potential life-saving clinical trials to our community? Yes, we can, but with a couple of asterisks. With some difficulty, a lot of enthusiasm, and a really fantastic and motivated trials team like we have here. And I think we do need additional funding and resources to support research in Southwest Sydney. This is just an example, just to let you all know just the amazing work that Liverpool Cancer Clinical Trials is doing. So Professor Wei Chua is a director of the unit. Megan Ford has done an amazing job in so many things. I can't begin to say how much she's done. But she coordinates, I direct the early phase trials units, and we have different oncologists leading each of the tumor stream specific units. It's a very large clinical trials unit. We have a number of staff, and we're well supported by the Ingham. And the fact that we can do translational research in Southwest Sydney is amazing. And it's a great selling point for sponsors and collaborators. We have over 100 years of clinical trials experience, many trial coordinators. So a lot of experience in our unit. I'm very proud to lead the phase 1 trials unit. And I think phase 1 trials is where many of the newest discoveries are coming and the most novel and innovative therapies. We have 4 consultants, 1 clinical trials fellow. We have 8 phase 1 trials. We have more opening across a range of immunotherapy and targeted therapy options. And so having these options available for our patients in Southwest Sydney, so they're not traveling across town to somewhere they're not familiar with their actual regular providers, is amazing. And we're still continuing to grow like that. Our research is embedded into our care as part of our research strategy and our cancer plan, which is great. And finally, how are we meeting the challenges? So we're improving research literacy. So we're producing a multilingual pamphlet that's available in different languages. What is research? Am I a guinea pig? What's the point? Thinking about posters. We're trying to get support for trial navigators to overcome all those barriers I kind of described, cultural training for staff, and ongoing advocacy for funding. My PhD is also in equity and trial access. So I've done a survey of Australian clinical trials workforce. This is part of my ongoing work. And I'm just going to present you one piece of data where we asked people, what services do you have to assist CALD patients to access clinical trials? You know, this is just a quick qualitative table that we made. 30% said nothing available. 43% had in-person interpreters, but many interesting themes. We're just relying on chance and accident to hope that someone can speak their language. And the demand on interpreter services is huge. So we need more interpreter access. So this is something more systematic needs to be in place. This is a priority to the Australia Cancer Plan as well. And I won't begin, I'll just mention briefly that Indigenous recruitment is also very low. That is also a priority of the Cancer Plan. What's our vision finally? We want to provide a comprehensive cancer clinical trials portfolio to residents South West Sydney. We want to be as competitive as the large academic centres, and we want our community to have the same access to cancer clinical trials those communities have. We have a huge population in South West Sydney with high cancer rates and needs, and we're obliged to provide them with access to these clinical trials. And we recognise the need in rural, regional areas as well. We want to build capacity. And I think ultimately a patient's postcode, background, or language cannot, in modern Australia, determine their ability to participate in a clinical trial. And just one image to leave you with, the same way we think about ramps and disability, same thing, we're going to think about these populations. We need ramps to kind of help these patients into trials. Trials are quite complex, but ramps can help, whether it's interpreters or navigators or whatever it is. And finally, you've all seen this, equality, equity, and justice. This is about equity. Thank you. I think I went slightly over time.
Thanks, Abby. That was really great. And you did very well to keep to time as well. So thank you. The work that Abby has been doing in developing our phase 1 and the experience he's brought has been fantastic. And I'll talk a little bit about more phase 1 in a minute. I'd now like to welcome Connie Catalaris, who has been one of our busiest physicians over the last 2.5 years, given her background in immunology. So Connie's going to talk to us about why she does clinical trials in immunology and allergy. So over to you. Thanks, Connie.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Meg, and thank you for the invitation. I think as I go through my slides, you'll see that there are a number of synergies across the presentations you've already heard. I've been asked to give a very personal view of why I do clinical trials. So my specialty is immunology and allergy, and put very simplistically, we deal with problems with the immune system. They may be overactivity in parts of the immune system, leading to a variety of allergic disorders and other hypersensitivities. Underactive parts of the immune system lead to diseases such as immune deficiencies, and inappropriate activity leads to a host of autoimmune disorders. The thing in common with these diseases is that most of them are chronic, long-term diseases. To date, most of them are incurable, which means a long-term commitment to treatments for patients, and this has considerable impacts on quality of life and daily functioning. And many of the disorders we deal with are rare genetic disorders and often get forgotten or overlooked. So my interest in clinical trials started probably in my student years. Pharmacology was my most favourite subject. I've always been interested in how drugs can manipulate various biochemical systems and can be harnessed for good and for treatments. I'm also interested in the pursuit of the scientific method and evidence-based medicine. I find that clinical trials is a way that a primary clinician can partake in investigative studies that add to the body of knowledge. I like the idea of exploring new drug treatments for previously untreated and underserved diseases. And this then allows one to contribute to bringing these successful treatments to market for a broader group of patients. In some circumstances, it allows patients early access to novel treatments where otherwise they would wait years for that. And finally, I think you gain expert knowledge in a new treatment environment, and that has spin-offs as well. So Les has already alluded to evidence-based medicine. This is the way that we do research for a medical condition or a treatment, which combines it with patient-centered outcomes as well as knowledge. And this leads to the strongest evidence we have from clinical trials. Participation also trains those clinicians or trialists in identifying well-planned and well-conducted research. So you become far more critical of reports that you read. Clinical trials are important, and I think that message has come along through the other speakers very loudly. We answer many questions through clinical trials. Does the new treatment work? How does it work compared to other treatments? What are the side effects and how severe? What do the patients think of the treatment? And does it, in fact, add to their outcomes and improve their quality of life? And of course, we need this data if we are going to see these drugs registered by groups such as our own Therapeutic Goods Administration and ultimately reimbursed by the PBAC. I'm always amazed when I put out a call for patient volunteers as to why they do this, because there's a lot of problems associated with trial participation. Overwhelmingly, these patients are altruistic. They have a feeling of contributing and advancing understanding with new treatments. Others may come in because they have poor control over their condition or dissatisfaction with the current treatments, and they desire new therapies that may help. In the genetic disorders, they may be doing it for their families or their children's sake and hope for better outcomes for their families. From a participant point of view, there are benefits, and we've heard about some of these. There is the feeling of contributing to advancement in a particular condition's treatment. Because of the close liaison with doctors and nurses involved in the close monitoring, there is better compliance with medication and better outcomes in general for their condition. And in some circumstances, there may be the opportunity to have early access to novel treatment. But there are challenges for the patient participant. Need for multiple appointments is a major one. Multiple blood tests and other tests can be burdensome. The requirement to keep diaries, note medication use is also a burden. The need to cease usual treatments for a treatment that may not work as well is always a possibility. And of course, there is always the possibility of harm and side effects. And these have to be carefully discussed before a consent form is signed. From a personal or professional point of view, I believe there are so many rewards for doing this type of work. And in order to illustrate some of the points I've made on this slide, I want to use some specific examples from our own clinical trials work. First and foremost, and one of the other speakers already alluded to this, you build a team and you work collaboratively and closely with that team. And you do have to like each other because you do many hours together and often after hours. The spin-off of this is that the same team is the team that you work with in the clinic, in looking after patients day to day. And the rapport we have and the closeness we have and the unified commitment we have to patient care is really wonderful. And with these people, some of these people I've worked with for over 2 decades, and we do have a close collaboration. Clinical trials can lead to further investigator-led research. So in 2012, a long time ago now, we were a trial site for investigating a novel way to deliver immunoglobulins to patients with immunodeficiency. Up till this time, that necessitated a hospital visit, intravenous cannulation, and hours of sitting in a chair having an infusion. This was a new way of delivering that treatment subcutaneously with the patient in charge. And as a result of that trial, we were then invited to participate in another trial, finessing modes of delivery. Because of this work, we built up a large group of patients who were very keen on this treatment and wanted to continue. We ourselves were convinced of the benefit of this therapy for our patients and for the health system, because that got them out of hospital and into self-management, home-based treatment, which was just as efficacious as the old way of doing it. So we had achieved a great deal of expertise in training patients in how to do this treatment. And because of this, we were very early adopters. And in fact, we were the first group in New South Wales to have such a transition from intravenous to subcutaneous home-based therapy, with our highly skilled nurses training now over 100 patients on this program. Because of that large patient cohort, it gave us the opportunity to conduct our own investigator-led research into quality of life, surveying these patients before and after the switch in their treatment. As a result of that, and as a result of doing some cost-benefit analyses, we were able to produce research that we then went on to present at national meetings. And we showed a marked patient preference for the newer mode of delivery of this treatment. For this work, we were recognised 2 years ago with a Quality in Healthcare Award. So that was a long journey from 2012. Many patients have benefited from a superior treatment that is in their own hands, all starting from that clinical trial. In another disease state that I've been very interested in, that is severe uncontrolled asthma, we've done a number of studies using the newer monoclonal antibody treatments that have proven to be highly effective and are now available on authority script. These studies were part of a very large international collaborative studies across multiple sites globally. And we generated a great deal of data and information across all these sites. This has led to numerous scientific publications in high quality journals, and importantly, further collaboration with other international experts. Another example I want to use is one of my major areas of interest, which started way back in the early 1980s, and that's in a rare clinical genetic condition called hereditary angioedema. This is an autosomal dominant condition, so families are very impacted. 1 in 2 children of someone with this condition will also have the condition. And these people can suffer from random severe swellings that can be very life-threatening and have a huge impact on quality of life and functioning. And until the last 12, 13 years, we had virtually no access to useful treatments for this condition. So early on, we participated in a trial for the first effective on-demand treatment for this with a drug called icatibant. And the first study we did was an early study in 2004. Our work there led on to us being one of the sites, the only site in Australia that carried out one of the phase 3 studies, which were done worldwide. In 2010, because of the data that was generated, the TGA registered that drug for acute management of hereditary angioedema. For the patients of ours that had participated in trials, they had early access to that drug, which was truly life-changing. You can see here from my timeline that it was not available on authority script till 2013. So these patients had 3 years of effective use of a drug because they participated in the clinical study. Because of our long-term interest and because of the building up of a cohort of patients with this rare disease, we went on to be invited to participate in a number of clinical studies, looking at a range of other treatments that came into the clinical trial space. With this and our growing expertise, I was able to initiate the setting up of a patient organisation in our country, which reached the 10-year mark this year. I went on within our professional organisation, the Australasian Society of Clinical Immunology and Allergy, to form a working party and to write together a position paper of where we saw treatment should go. From this work, I was invited to participate in a number of international guideline writing and global forums with this disease. So This has led to a very long-term commitment at multiple levels of managing patients with this rare genetic disorder. As one of the other speakers has already said, clinical trial participation leads to invitations to attend international conferences, to give lectures and to participate in think tanks at the various disorders. And I find that particularly rewarding. But I don't want to leave you with only the positives. There are many challenges, and I think you have to be realistic if you're looking at taking on this work. It is a lot of hard work. It's sometimes tedious. You do need a commitment for the long haul, and you need to be available for your patients, for the clinical research assessors, for your clinical trial staff. So it's not all rosy. And I want to go through a couple of the big challenges. This is a picture of my clinical research coordinator as we decide to take on a study. She's very happy about it. She thinks it's all doable. We have a patient cohort. By the time we finish with the convoluted ethics process, she's looking more like this. We find some of the delays that we experience with ethics committees due to very trivial reasons. Sometimes I believe it's because they don't fully understand some of the global studies that are put up. I do, of course, understand the importance of an ethics committee and oversight, but I think it wouldn't be realistic not to highlight the fact that there are many frustrations dealing with the ethics committee. Other challenges include the new concept of e-diaries for recording symptoms and medication use. These were supposed to revolutionize patients' lives, but they are terrible things. Often they don't connect to Wi-Fi and they cause us a lot of heartache. The electronic medical record for clinical trials was supposed to dispense with paperwork, but this is not so. There are mountains of paperwork that we still have to contend with. And scheduling is always a challenge. We have to fit in with patients' lives. They have to fit in somewhat with our hours of operation. So these are challenges that continually face us. But overall, I see doing clinical trials as a clinician as an overall very positive experience. It increases one's knowledge in specific areas, and I find it a way for a clinician to contribute to the acquisition of evidence-based medicine. And as I've pointed out, there are many positives for the hard work that you put in. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Connie. We really appreciate your perspective on running clinical trials. I'd now like to welcome the panel. Eileen McDonald is going to be our facilitator, and Eileen is actually the chair of our Consumer Research Committee here in Southwestern Sydney. I would then like to welcome Tom Coleman, who is a patient who's actually been on a clinical trial. So he's going to share some of his experience with us all. Jenny McBride, who is a health advocate working with the Sphere MSK CAG. You've met Mark, but Mark comes to the panel with a perspective of being on a clinical trial himself. And then we've got Abby as well, who is going to talk a little bit about the advocacy for the COLD population in more detail. So Eileen, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan, and to the Directorate and the District for giving us this opportunity. We hope this consumer panel will be a really invigorating conversation that will raise questions and positive challenges for the clinicians and researchers in our district as you seek to find ways to meaningfully and appropriately better engage with consumers so that the co-design and co-production of clinical trials, not just consumers as participants in the actual trial space as well. So we have our first question now for Jenny. What advice would you give to our clinicians to ensure effective co-design so that we avoid tokenism in the consumer involvement of clinical trials?
Thanks, Eileen. Great to be here. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that this is not a new concept, so people being involved in research that are not just the participants. And we want to acknowledge that many researchers have worked in this way for some time. Our group in particular have definitely experienced really positive involvement with researchers. So just a few key points. So a big one in the consumer space is remuneration. So, and this can be obviously quite broad. So I think avoiding not having the conversation, you need to have the conversation up front and explain why, if there is no budget available, and be honest. So, but remuneration can help people feel valued and help them to actually participate in the research. So, you know, they may be taking time off work, or not able to spend time with family. So it's really important that they have this opportunity to be remunerated. Payments can be quite broad. So they could be, for example, people like to offer donations to charity or vouchers for themselves and their families. Also, attending conferences and being involved in training opportunities. So, consumers really do want to be involved. Engaging consumers early on in the research. So, when researchers are going for grants, we don't want to have that call at the last minute. We want to feel like we've been involved really early on in the process. So, and that's going to help researchers ask more meaningful questions, and the lived experience of the consumer is going to be heard, and that's going to lead to overall better health outcomes. Also, as well, like keeping consumers that are involved in the research process engaged. So we really want, we want updates on the study. So being involved in meetings, finding out where the study is, and it's just going to help people feel, more involved, more enjoyment, and it's going to keep them engaged in the whole process. And then from there, then they can share that with the, with the wider community. So I think in my experience, and when we discuss within our group, is that tokenism can be really avoided if we if they take the time and care to build the relationships.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Those are excellent points, and I'm sure will be good reminders so that clinicians and researchers avoid tokenism through planning for consumer involvement in every level of the research, right from the beginning, from even writing the actual grant application, and then they can include the funding needs of being able to adequately remunerate for the expertise that lived experience brings. So what good points. Thank you so much. Thomas, can we go to you, Tom?
Yeah, no problem.
And the question we'd like to ask you today, as somebody who's participated in a clinical trial that I believe just only finished in recent times and has gone for a few years now, before you started the clinical trial, what did you think it might be like? Did you have any expectations? And now that it's finished, what's changed for you in what you think about clinical trials?
Well, I had no idea what I was expecting. I was asked to go on the trial blind. I didn't know what was going to happen. But after I sat down with the people involved, the doctors, and I think it was a team, I said, I started to come around really quick because I've had about 6 heart attacks. And every time I've been in hospital, and I've had 6 bypasses done in one go here at Liverpool Hospital. And every time I was in hospital, from doctors to nurses to admin staff, every hospital to here in Little Campbelltown, I was treated with respect and given, and I got the best service I could ever wanted. Okay, so when they asked me to go on the trial, I didn't know what to expect. I'm dead scared of giving myself needles for a start, but I thought, no, I owe it to people to go in and do these trials that can save some other people going through what I went through, and I should do it. And I did. And when I started to do the trials, I was surprised with the way people looked at me is in the clinic staff, all right through from the nurses, the receptionists. They were just, you know, they treated you like a human being, that you were there for a purpose, not just a guinea pig. And I liked that, and that was really good. So I went on with it and learned how to give myself an injection, and now I'm giving it to the lady I'm a carer for because she won't take a diabetic needle, so I'll give them to her. But no, it's when you're in a trial, you really want to be respected and be informed, and you know, be told what is actually going on. You know, I mean, I knew about heart attacks, I knew about stents, and I had all that stuff. But the diet side of things, I just sort of said, you know, oh, okay. After you start to feel okay, you go back to the old habits, you know. But when you talk to the people in a trial, they stress why you should stay on it. The exercise. I mean, I consider myself pretty fit when I was about 30. I used to do martial arts, I used to play soccer. After I gave that up. But in the meantime, I was drinking with the guys as well after the games. But once I started losing a bit of fitness, then I didn't push myself to keep going. I thought, I'll be right. But you know, they tell you must keep up the fitness. You've got to keep up the fitness and the exercise.
So now that you've finished the clinical trial, what's changed for you?
Well, I still watch my diet. I don't eat very much at all. I eat enough to keep us.
So it was because of the trial that you've made some lifestyle changes?
That's right. But I don't drink anymore.
Mhm.
Right? And you know, they open your eyes because it's not just one person that's telling you. It's the doctor, it's the nurses and the clinic staff. You know, they're all saying the same thing. So, you know, obviously I was doing something wrong, not them.
So you're glad you participated?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. I actually looked forward to coming down to the hospital that month or every 6 weeks, whatever it was, when I was coming down. And I used to always get there an hour early, sit in the reception,
Wow.
because it was, I look forward to it, because the way I was treated, the information I was given, you know, and, you know, it wasn't just like Melissa, the doctor that looked after the trials, she actually found out that I had an aneurysm in my brain, and it was quite large.
So that wasn't part of the trial?
No, that was
But by
just
being a participant,
Yeah.
some other health issues were
general
taken
conversation.
care of or that emerged?
Yeah.
Thank you for, I know this is so short because you've got a couple years of experience there you could be talking about, but just the bit you've said now is so valuable.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we go now to our next participant, which I believe is Mark. And Mark, the question for you is, how has your experience when you were a clinical trial participant in another area of health than what, because of your own health needs and totally different from what you now do as a clinician and researcher, how has it changed the way you approach patients to be part of your trials? Or has it?
It's a good question. So I actually had acute leukemia a few years ago, and it was a challenging time because I was very ill, as you can imagine, and I was approached to participate in quite a lot of clinical trials, and I was quite unwell and pretty angry with being sick. So, on quite a few occasions, I told the people that approached me to participate to go away, but because I felt that after reading the information sheet, I didn't think that the research was really all that valid. But some of the clinical trials that I was approached about obviously were, and I was involved in a new chemotherapy agent, which was only available through the trial. And
So how did that change what you do now?
well, I think even before then, I was on the local ethics committee, and I was always saying the participant information sheets are way too long. Nobody reads them. Nobody takes 10% of what we give them, even if English is their first language, let alone if it's not. So I've always been really strong advocate for having a simple one-page summary. But the problem is we often get faced with these ridiculously long information sheets that are driven by the industry and their lawyers, etc. I find that really incredibly frustrating.
So it's changed for you in that you're really passionate about ensuring that things are an easier process for patients to be able to
Absolutely.
get involved.
Particularly when you're acutely unwell, because the last thing you want is someone bothering you to read a 40-page information sheet.
Yeah, that's a great point. We'll come back to you later for some more information. And Avi, I know you're not in the room with us, you're online with us. And we're just wondering, with your perspective, how has your experience of being working with the cow population, the barriers you've already mentioned in your talk, but we're wondering, do you want to expand on some of the barriers beyond language, for example, that there might be there for engaging patients from a cow background?
Thank you, Eileen. In a very short sense, it's time. So time is the biggest barrier. Liverpool, as we talked about, is such a busy hospital, serve a huge population. And I'm a clinician researcher, so we're doing research along with our clinical standard of care work. So having time, and as Mark said, research is such a complicated process, and someone's vulnerable and they might be dying or they might be up against it. And to hold someone's hand through that process, to bring them onto a trial, takes trust, it takes time, it takes communication. With the cow population, I have the interpreter, which is the biggest thing, but there are also culture-specific beliefs as well. So some cultures have particular ideas about Western medicine, how we do research, because clinical research is actually central to the kind of Western project of evidence gathering, of uncertainty, of randomization. And these are not simple things to talk about. And just to be a bit more specific, there's extensive research. So the way to think about it is patient level barriers, site barriers, and sponsor barriers and ethics barriers. So patient barriers are misapprehensions and misconceptions around clinical research. Site barriers are clinician bias. A clinician just looks at it and goes, I can't do this on a Monday afternoon. I'm too tired. I can't do it. And so that's just implicit bias. Also, access to interpreters. I call for an interpreter and they're going to come in half an hour. I can't do this anymore. So we need easy access to interpreters. Sponsor level. So the way trials are designed, some trials are exclusionary. So they say only English speaking, and I think that's unacceptable. So they need to have patient-reported outcomes, quality of life measures translated. The PISs need to be translated. They can be translated. They need to be translated. And finally, when ethics boards look at these research projects, they need to make sure they are culturally inclusive. But that's kind of a picture of where I would think.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much for that, because it's not just about having translation, there's all the cultural considerations as well, and acknowledging these things do take time. Yeah, thank you for that. All of your points, I hope, have been informative for those who've been listening today. There's so much more we could be saying, but to wrap up the panel session, the last question for all of you, and really just a sentence maybe, not longer than that, just in a few words, what are the benefits of having consumers involved in clinical trials, not just as the patient in the trial, but from every aspect, every level of informing the research, evaluating the research, co-presenting the research, co-authoring, all the possibilities that are there that will improve research. So can we start with you, Tom?
Yeah, well, I think it's just to get people in there, there's got to be a variety of people and honesty from the start, what they're going to do. And because some people are just scared.
Okay,
to
clear
take into it. Yeah.
explanation from the
Exactly.
beginning of expectations so that people can know what they're doing.
That's exactly right, because they're not going to jump into it if there's nothing at the end of the tunnel. If they know up front, they'll think you'll go.
Excellent, thanks, Tom. Jenny?
Same thing, I think, stronger relationships, it's going to build the community, it's going to, take away that us and them, and it's going to, better use of funding, and then hopefully better health outcomes for everyone who's involved.
Being part of the team in a
Yeah.
really equitable way and knowing that the outcomes are going to be benefiting.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Mark?
Hard to give a short answer, but I guess I've found that being involved with consumers has been helpful in many ways, particularly when you design a trial. Consumers much more likely to tell you that what you're talking about is rubbish than one of your colleagues, unless it's theirs or somebody. But also, I think in terms of designing the right outcomes, so Abby mentioned the patient-reported outcomes. I think it's really important to get input from consumers on what outcomes are meaningful to them. And I don't think they need to have actually had the disease to be.
No. Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's valuable. Avi, I'll let you finish up with this question.
I think the consumer voice is critical. It's so refreshing. Doctors and scientists often get into a group think, but hearing a patient or a consumer just say, I can't come into the hospital 5 times a day. We think things in our mind, but they're actually not practical. But hearing a patient just look at it and say, this is what is feasible, not feasible. I think it's fundamental. And I think all cancer research, patient involvement is mandatory. So it's something I think is really valuable.
Thank you so much to the whole panel. Everything you've said, I'm sure will mean something different to each of our listeners, and we're grateful for your involvement today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panel. This has been really fabulous, and we really do appreciate that you've joined us. So thank you very much, and we'll let you go and go back to listening to everything that's continuing to happen. So thank you to if everyone can just give them a round of applause, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. It's so nice to hear from people who have been involved in clinical trials, and it's one of my favourite parts of this role is getting that feedback from people. So it's wonderful we can have the panel, and I'll talk about a couple of things we're going to do moving forward that also engages our consumers a little bit more within Southwestern Sydney at an overall level. So I'm going to talk to you about clinical trials in Southwestern Sydney, and being that everyone else has talked about a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about again on my slides as well. But just to give you an idea, we've really seen a massive increase in clinical trials in Southwestern Sydney over the last 2 years. I think this is a real tribute to everybody working across our LHD and the Ingham and at the private hospitals, because really in a time where a lot of other departments and a lot of other facilities have decreased their clinical trials activities, we've actually increased ours, which is quite phenomenal. One thing I am very proud of about our LHD is that we've actually not only increased our commercial clinical trials, but we've increased the number of clinical trials that are the academic and the investigator-led studies. And that's a really big thing to do in a time where we've been dealing with COVID, and we've seen a lot of other facilities actually stop clinical trials. And it also, I guess, the thing that everyone should remember is that at an industry level, site growth is 5.8% year on year. We've grown 38 and 34% in our clinical trial activity. So it is something for us to be very proud of and to reflect about that really clinical trials are becoming embedded into clinical care, and that's what we want it to be. If you look at the facility trials and how many trials are being run across the facilities, we are still seeing a large number being run at Liverpool, but we are working really hard to make sure that we have that equity of care. We've introduced new procedures such as being able to have satellite sites so that people can be seen in hospitals across our LHD rather than it just be in one hospital. We're building capabilities within Campbelltown and Bankstown on a daily basis. And those are things that we really do want to make sure that we continue to do to be able to offer clinical trials and that equity across our LHD. I couldn't have this slide without talking, this presentation without talking about COVID. COVID has been a massive part of the last 2.5 years for the clinical trials teams. As you can well imagine, it has been keeping clinical trials running and actually being able to keep our patients and our clinical trial staff safe has been paramount, and it's taken a lot of business continuity planning to have that happen. We have done things like introduce care in the home, be able to send drug to patients in their home, to have them have remote visits and then be able to do things like have their blood test nearer to home. So there have been some really big things that have happened that have benefited the patients that are participating in our clinical trials, but also set the scene for what is an industry trend of, and everybody will have heard of this, decentralised clinical trials. We are very well set up to be able to manage people remotely, and it is something that we will continue to look at doing so that we can actually make it easier for people to participate in clinical trials. We did coordinate 22 COVID clinical trials, which were across therapeutics, devices and observational studies through the Clinical Trial Support Unit. That included doing things like ethics applications and RGO submissions. And I do need to give a shout out to the Ethics Committee and the RGO teams within Southwestern Sydney, because we had 11 ad hoc meetings to be able to quickly approve protocols and get studies up and running. Our record protocol to get up and running over the COVID period was 10 days from when we had the final protocol to when we could screen our first patient, and that is phenomenal. We managed operations centrally. So one of the most tricky things during COVID was, of course, people were redeployed, and therefore we had to make sure that we could not only deliver on our COVID clinical trials, but our other clinical trials. So from an operations and a staffing perspective, we worked with all of the departments and the teams to make sure that we could cover the clinical trials. There were 7 departments that lent staff to ICU and to respiratory, and those departments really did mean that we could continue to make sure patients were being put onto the clinical trials. We have on one clinical trial that is a collaborative group clinical trial, we have over 250 patients, and that is a platform study that allows for different therapies to be given to patients in ICU. And we have an observational study where we've got over 500 participants on that clinical trial. So whilst COVID was very challenging for everybody, I think it really showed the depth of the experience within our LHD, the willingness for the teamwork, and, you know, we really did pull out all stops to make sure that we could deliver treatments to people who were COVID positive. So what makes us attractive in Southwestern Sydney? It's all about the people for me. We have such a great team of clinical trial staff. We have the 3 investigators who presented to you are clinicians, and they're also working on clinical trials, but they are 3 of hundreds of people who work on our clinical trials. We now have over 450 clinical trial team members in our LHD, from people who are just starting on their clinical trial career journey to people who have got 20 years of experience and industry and globally known. So we are very fortunate, and everybody does this work on top of their very busy clinical workload. So that makes us very attractive. One of the things that I have told to me by our commercial sponsors all the time is that the investigators in Southwestern Sydney are always extremely engaged, extremely willing to give their time, and that they feel very supported. In the name of time, I'm just going to talk about a couple of other really quick things. Our phase 1 capabilities. We have a phase 1 unit in Liverpool Hospital, but we are also growing our phase 1 capabilities outside of Liverpool as well. So, for example, people like Connie are doing phase 1 clinical trials at Campbelltown as well. So we're very fortunate in that we get to offer people really novel, unique medications that they wouldn't get. And a lot of those are in rare diseases and rare cancers. And they are life-saving treatments or potentially life-saving treatments. We also have very good processes and technology in place. So I do laugh and say COVID allowed us to do things that we never thought we would be able to do, but we implemented an electronic investigator site file. We implemented an electronic consent platform, which would have taken a lot longer had it not been for COVID. We have the technology for people to remotely monitor, for people to work at home, for us to see our patients in the home. So we are that makes us very attractive as a place to do research. And I think last but not least is the quality of our clinical trials and our clinical trials teams. We have been audited by the FDA and we have been audited by the EMA. The TGA are about to bring in auditing, so I'm suspecting we'll be audited by the TGA shortly as well. But our quality has stood up. We've had no major or critical findings in any of those audits, which is a tribute to the work that the team does day in, day out. So what's next for us in Southwestern Sydney? I guess there's a lot of things that we have in the pipeline. One of the things that is a challenge, and anyone who does clinical trials will know this, training clinical trial staff takes time. It takes dedicated teams. And whilst the clinical trial support unit does offer training, we need to grow and develop that. So we will actually have a dedicated clinical trials manager for training in the next couple of weeks. I'm hoping that person will start, and we will start to actually roll out dedicated training programs that you'll all see. We have got centralised resourcing, so we've got a centralised startup team. We also have, we're also looking at doing a pool for clinical trial coordinators, because we need that experienced staff. So if someone goes on holidays or somebody leaves, then we need to be able to actually bring those people, continue to deliver the work. We're also looking at partnerships so that our rural and remote patients have the ability to be seen closer to home. And that's something that there'll be a bit more of an announcement about, a partnership coming up very shortly. Decentralised trials is something that is nice with rural and remote, and we'll talk about that model and roll that out to the investigators in August. And then the cold support. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have in our LHD, with 49% of our population, English isn't their first language at home. So being able to support that, it takes resource, it takes energy, it takes time, but it's something that is critical for us to do, and we're very dedicated to doing that. And then finally, this is the clinical trial support team. And I do want to say a big thank you to each and every one of them for everything that they do every day in supporting clinical trials across our LHD. But this is not the only team that does that. So behind us, we have IT, we have administration, we have the EMR team, we have finance, we have the research directorate. So without those people, we couldn't do what we do on a day-to-day basis. So I would like to say thank you not only to my team, but to everybody who contributes to us being able to deliver clinical trials in Southwestern Sydney. So I'm going to introduce Chris to you next. Hi, Chris, welcome. So Chris Komatis is from IQVIA, and we have a partnership with IQVIA in terms of we get to look at all their clinical trials. And so we're very fortunate to have Chris with us. Chris is probably feeling pretty stressed because he had a flat tire on the way here. And so he has just arrived. So Chris, I'll hand over to you to have a little bit of a chat about the future of clinical trials.
Sure, no problem. And thank you. And yes, apologies for any rattleness I have this morning. Flat tire and a full hospital parking lot. It's been my day this today, but great to be here today, and thanks for everyone that's joining. As Meg said, my name is Chris Komatis. I'm an associate director at IQVIA, and I sit within the Real World Solutions team. Really fortunate to be able to collaborate with the likes of the Ingham Institute, Meg, and the team. Around not only Liverpool, but the entire Southwest Sydney local health district. The topic for today is really just kind of focusing on kind of the driving patient centricity in clinical trials and trying to take a little bit of a snapshot into the future, especially around the data that we're seeing and how to utilize kind of technology and AI. So I'll just quickly, for those that don't know, IQVIA, we are a company that's been around for quite some time, for about 75 years, but we're the amalgamation of the combination of two companies. One, Quintiles, which was a CRO, which many of you probably know, and the other being IMS, which is one of the largest providers of data into the pharmaceutical and life science industry. So as you see there, we're quite a large organization across the world and have lots of very smart and clever people working around data science and healthcare. Part of my role is to help organizations like the Ingham and others across Australia and New Zealand really enhance their capabilities to do research and clinical trials through the creation of what we call research-ready data networks. When we do this by leveraging several bits of technology that IQVIA has acquired and built across the years. And there's a quick graphic that shows you kind of what we do in a nutshell around taking kind of structured data, which would be things like, from your electronic medical records, from medical claims, clinical notes, and unstructured data as well. So using processes like natural language processing and what we call NLP, and putting those together into a structured context that providers and others can use to really look at data to really help make decisions. And that's what we're trying to do, is take all this data, bring it all together through analytics platforms, and enable those stakeholders within healthcare to be able to make decisions relevant to their businesses. So that's kind of in a nutshell of what IQVIA does. What I'm here to talk about today, sorry, this is the bill that we'll get rid of. More so is looking at the challenges of transformation into the future of clinical trials. And I'll talk today a little bit about what is termed as, you may know, as real world evidence and real world data, and then some of the ways that we capture that through emerging technologies. So as you know, when we're looking at clinical trials, the sponsors and providers, we've been a bit slow, and with good reason, in terms of adopting innovative technologies. And not to say that innovation hasn't existed within healthcare on a daily basis in terms of solving problems, but more so when we talk about administration and structure in terms of technology and data. And this is all changing because we're seeing this convergence of medical knowledge, or increases in the amounts of real world data, real world evidence, which I'll explain in a second, and the advances in technology around how we're able to collect, curate, clean, standardize, and manage the data, which is really transformational for most providers. We're also then harnessing this data, utilizing technology such as AI, which we'll talk about in a bit, to enhance productivity. And I will also mention sustainability of the clinical trial process, and also leading to improved patient experiences and accelerating our decision-making processes. The other impact that we're seeing in the environment is obviously moving to more of a patient-centric kind of environments where, you know, the patient was one that was, put into this quagmire of regulations, payers, providers. We're now kind of seeing that all of those organizations are really revolving around the patient and the patient needs. And I think as we continue to democratize healthcare data, you're seeing that this landscape is becoming more patient-centric by the second. Another real kind of driver has been the regulators. So regulators around the world has said, well, what are we doing with all this new data, with this real world evidence that we're creating outside of structured clinical trials or RCTs? And we're really seeing kind of guidance being driven by the likes of the FDA and the TGA that are both releasing guidance on how we can best leverage real world evidence and continue to this transformation around clinical trials and around how we best utilize that data, how we gain greater insights, and how we kind of, as a multiple stakeholder group, really kind of leverage what we're learning from there. So and the reason why this is happening is because we're seeing this explosion of obviously technology through ubiquitous devices such as phones, you know, wearables. We're seeing more and more biosensors that are being used in healthcare. All are rapidly increasing in terms of utilization and access to these technologies. We know that the data holds the potential to allow us to better design clinical trials and conduct these trials in various healthcare settings, both within providers and also decentralized outside of the provider networks. And additionally, we're seeing the development of this new analytic capability through AI, through machine learning, and other statistical capabilities, really kind of driving better insights and deeper insights into kind of research questions as we move forward. So where is this data coming from? And that's kind of where some of the challenges lie. It's coming from such a disparate amount of sources. So when we talk about real world data, it's the data relating directly to patient status, healthcare status, and the delivery of healthcare. And you can see there it comes from the sources such as electronic medical records, claims, billing, product and disease registries, all of which are considered real world data and all of which have different standards and different models of collection, but we try to kind of, again, bring them all together to be utilized effectively. And then we look at real world evidence, which is looking at the clinical evidence regarding the usage of these data sets and seeing what the benefits and the risks of whatever medical product or whatever studies that we're trying to conduct. And these, again, are really generated by, as you can see there, but not limited to, our RCTs, our pragmatic trials and observational studies as well. And just wanted to point out probably knowledge is the differences between, you know, kind of the real world evidence and RCTs there. I'm kind of running out of time, so I won't get into all the details there. And then quickly just going into AI, we're seeing this really this need for AI in terms of the definitions. There's a lot going on around education, around how we use artificial intelligence and machine learnings, you know, from I want to say the administrators and operators of healthcare all the way down to researchers and clinicians themselves, really trying to leverage AI as these algorithms to really enhance our understanding of the data that's there. We'll kind of go through too much, but here's a timeline of kind of where we're seeing this advancement. We're seeing kind of everything from today from e-consent, PREMS and PROMs, risk-based site monitoring, all the way through to probably the 5 to 10 year horizon, looking at synthetic control arms in silico, and looking at AI tools more as a predictive tool to clean data or autonomously. And just finally, you know, we're looking at the patient journey, and this I won't go through it all with lack of time, but we'll have a really unique way in the future how a patient goes through a clinical trial, a digital trial, through the utilization of all of these tools, which will enable us to really find more patients, be able to look at more diverse and inclusive populations that we're kind of quite missing at the moment in our current clinical trials, and be able to kind of really leverage that data for the health of a broader segment of our society. I won't go through basically the summary, but basically looking at how we use AI and patient centricity to improve the overall clinical trial experience. It's not just about the data, it's also about the patients and how we engage with patients as we move forward. So thank you. Sorry that this was a bit truncated and a bit speedy, but if there's any other questions around IQVIA's AI solutions, please don't feel free to contact me.
Thanks
very
so
much.
much, Chris. For everyone, I did used to work for IQVIA, and some of the things that go on behind the scenes with the data are quite outstanding. And so we will run some series this year just to be able to give people some education on that as well, because I think it's really important. So Les, I'm going to pass to you to close for us. Thank you to everybody who has presented today and the panel. We really do appreciate it. But Les, I'll throw to you. Thanks.
Okay, listen, thank you very much indeed. This has been an outstanding symposium. I've learned a lot, and I think most people who would have joined also would agree that they've learned a lot. It's so refreshing to participate in a symposium that asks, why do I do it? How do I do it? Was it easy? Was it fun? Was it worthwhile? And especially in a symposium that allows us to at least get a glimpse of what our consumers think about our research and our work. And thank you to those consumers who have participated. Can I remind us that clinical trials are not new? The first clinical trial is said to have been done in biblical days in 500 BC. There was no HREC then, and there was no legal or issues concerned with clinical trials, certainly no AI, but Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of what is now Iran, decided to divide his army into those that eat meat alone and drink wine versus those who eat vegetables. And he wanted to find out which of the two would be better fighting men. I don't know who won that particular clinical trial, but this was the first clinical trial. I think we must agree that there are many steps that lead to a successful clinical trial, and some of the issues that were brought forth today are worthwhile considering, especially with respect to some of the difficulties and burdens that are associated with conducting clinical trials. So I think we need to consider these. We can bring them up to our own HREC, but more importantly to OHMR to discuss some of the barriers to clinical trials that occur throughout New South Wales and indeed throughout Australia. And I think, as Mark Parsons said, a simplification of some of these processes would certainly go a long way. I'm very excited to hear the last speaker and the use of big data and artificial intelligence in furthering clinical trials. And I think this is where we will be heading into the future. And I think the Ingham Institute and Southwestern Sydney LHD are well positioned to do that because of our Robotics, Medical Devices and Health Technology Centre. Once again, Meg, can I thank you and your team for leading our clinical trials in Southwestern Sydney and in the LHD. You've got a magnificent team that you showed us there, and the work that you've done over the last couple of years since your appointment has truly transformed our participation in clinical trials, which at the end of the day is going to serve one main thing, and that is to bring better health to our population. So thank you, everybody, and especially thank you to Anna Marie de Souza and Rachel Goldrick for organising this very informative symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Les. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We hope you enjoyed it. And we will, there's some exciting sessions coming up in the rest of the year as well, so we hope you can attend those. So thanks very much.